As the 999th year of the 41st millennium approached, the Imperium was beset by foes from every side. New Tyranid hive fleets, the Kraken and the Leviathan, struck at the galaxy in the span of only 4 years. While the Kraken was narrowly defeated, the Leviathan's push towards Terra was only delayed. Drawn like a moth to the psychic flame of the Astronomicon, Hive Fleet Leviathan was diverted into a conflict with the Orcs of the Octarius sector by the actions of the Inquisitor Lord Cryptman. On the world of Armageddon, the Imperium faced the largest Orc Wa since the War of the Beast. A massive Imperial mobilization managed to temporarily blunt its momentum and drive its leader, the warlord Ezekyle off-world. But the self-proclaimed prophet of the green-skinned gods promised to one day return, with every Orc tribe in the galaxy, for a final showdown. While centuries had passed since Tagarath of Corinto had proclaimed the start of the time of ending, the portents of disaster had only grown more ominous as the 41st millennium ended. New oracles appeared across the galaxy, proclaiming that disaster was at hand. Growing nervous, the High Lords of Terra requested that the master of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica attempt to psychically probe the Eye of Terror in the hope of discovering what the forces of chaos had planned. But when the powerful psyker carried out his probe, he detected no activity of any kind. It was almost as if an invisible curtain had been drawn around the boundaries of the Great Warp Rift. This was suspicious in itself, and he cautioned the High Lords that this could be the calm before the storm. The warning proved prescient. Within the Eye of Terror, Abaddon the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos, had succeeded in the rare feat of uniting all the traitor legions under his command. With the Chaos Gods in alignment in a way not seen since the Horus heresy, the Despoiler prepared to unleash his 13th Black Crusade. It would be the largest invasion of Imperial space by the forces of chaos since Horus had attempted to overthrow the Emperor. And its target was the fortress world of Cadia. If the Black Crusade could break through the formidable defenses of the Cadian Gate, the route to Terra would lie open once more. Abaddon and the Black Legion would at last have the chance to succeed where Horus had failed. It began with increased sightings of the derelict starships known as Space Hulks, emerging from the warp around the Cadian sector, and then worse. An entire Chaos fleet dedicated to the service of the plague god Nurgle, led by the battleship Terminus Est, the flagship of the Chaos Lord Typhus of the Death Guard, began to spread pestilence across the sector. The Imperial physicians of the Officio Medicae proved powerless to stop the spread of these warp-infused diseases. Apocalyptic religious orders began to appear on the afflicted worlds, preaching that the Emperor's wrath had descended on them as punishment for their sins. The worst of the epidemics was known as the Plague of Unbelief. The infected saw their bodies rot away from under them until they were resurrected as flesh-hungry corpses animated by the power of the plague god. A bite or a scratch from a single one of these plague zombies could spread the infection. Entire worlds of the sector were eventually abandoned, their garrisons overrun by billions of the walking dead. Despite the growing strife in the sectors surrounding the Eye of Terror, the Imperial fortress world of Cadia, the Imperium's first line of defense against an invasion out of the Eye, remained a beacon of stability. To face the growing chaos activity, the Cadian High Command ordered every regiment of the Astra Militarum's Cadian shock troopers and many of their allies to muster on Cadia itself. Hundreds of extra landing fields were prepared around the Cadian city of Khazar Tyrok in preparation for the reinforcements. Millions of troops were already assembled when the Volscani Cataphracts Regiment, considered to be among the most hardened units in the sector, landed on Cadia. In honor of the Volscani Regiment's reputation, the Cadian planetary governor and high command had gathered personally at the Tyrock Fields to welcome them to the fortress world. But unknown to the Imperial commanders, the Volscani had already sworn themselves to the service of the Chaos Gods. As soon as they emerged from their transports, the Volscani launched an attack that killed the governor and the majority of the high command, and left the Cadian forces reeling. In the heat of battle, Lord General Ursarkar E. Creed of the 8th Cadian Regiment took command of the scattered Imperial forces. He led them in a lightning counterattack that slowly and painfully isolated and then surrounded the Volscani traitors until every renegade lay dead. Creed's quick thinking and willingness to assume responsibility when others had lost their head was typical. He had been born into humble circumstances on Cadia, his parents and sister slain early in his childhood during an attack by Chaos cultists. Creed had risen through the ranks from a common soldier on the basis of his tactical genius and his almost superhuman determination to stand against chaos no matter the cost. In the wake of the disastrous Battle of the Tyrock Fields, Ursarkar E. Creed was named the governor of Cadia and the Lord Castellan of all its military forces. It did not come a moment too soon. Battles erupted throughout the Cadian sector as the first wave of Abaddon's forces swept across the Imperial defenders. A Chaos fleet advanced into the Cadia system and established bases on its outlying worlds. From there, the forces of Chaos attacked the fortress world itself. The numbers of Chaos cultists, traitor marines, and demons were so great that after a few months of battle, only a single major bastion, the city of Khazar Kraft, remained in Imperial hands. Lord Castellan Creed had few options at this point. Under his command were the remaining battered regiments of the Astra Militarum, a garrison force of Adepta Sororitas Sisters of Battle from the Order of Our Martyred Lady, and detachments from the Dark Angels and Black Templar Space Marine chapters. Despite all the fighting, Creed knew that Abaddon himself had never made planetfall, and therefore it stood to reason that the final assault was yet to come. The Chaos forces had also destroyed the Imperial Navy fleet defending Cadia. All that remained to try and slow down the final Void assault on the fortress world was the Space Wolves battle barge Fire Main's Fang. Already damaged by the previous assaults, it had been coaxed back to life following a reactor overload by its crew. Creed also had little hope of reinforcements. Cadia's only astropaths were long dead, and so Creed rounded up whatever psychers remained to him and ordered them placed within a jury-rigged astropathic choir beacon. It was unlikely that their messages would be able to reach Terra in time to make any difference. And then word came from orbit that Abaddon's Black Fleet was at last inbound for Cadia. A swarm of warships, demon-possessed vessels, and space hulks so massive it seemed to blot out the stars. And among the fleet was spotted the massive bulk of a black stone fortress, the ancient alien artifacts whose main weapon was capable of destroying an entire planet. Creed at last realized the awful truth. Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade wasn't over. It hadn't even really begun. Elsewhere in the galaxy, the High Seers of the Asuryani craftworlds believed that the 13th Black Crusade represented the start of the Rana Dandra, the final battle between the Aldari species and Chaos. The Asuryani mystic Caesadurus the Anchorite proclaimed that the end times were upon them, After a lengthy meditation with the Farseer Eldrad Ulthran of Craftworld Ulthwé, Caesarus explained to the High Seers that their species' only hope for survival lay in awakening the Aldari god of the dead, Iniad, in the warp. Unfortunately, such a task likely required the sacrifice of every remaining Asuryani life. As both humanity and the craft world Aldari faced disaster, one being looked into the coming darkness and laughed. This was Kegarak, the laughing god, the trickster deity of the Aldari. He had been the only one of the Aldari's original gods not devoured or shattered by Slaanesh at her birth. He had fled into the webway, where his laughter continued to echo. His good humor was justified, for he had found a way to trick She Who Thirsts into expending all her power, not to destroy the Aldari, but to save them. Kegarak recorded this ultimate jest, his final act, within the pages of a crystal tome bound in chains of light that rested on a plinth in the Black Library. The Black Library was a special craft world that lay somewhere in the webway and contained every scrap of knowledge the Aldari had ever learned about chaos. But when Abaddon the Despoiler at last unleashed his great assault to overthrow the Emperor, the chains fell away, and the book fell from its pedestal with its pages wide open. Penned in inks of light and shadow, its words presented a slender hope for the Aldari factions and mankind. But it would require a galaxy-spanning performance of deception and manipulation by Kegarak's chosen people, the Aldari Harlequins. For the defenders of Cadia, that hope was far off. The discovery that Abaddon's Black Fleet had the Black Stone Fortress Will of Eternity in its possession sent Creed and his commanders into a flurry of activity. The Black Stone Fortresses had been 6 alien mobile star fortresses of unknown origin that once existed as converted Imperial Navy outposts in the Gothic sector. They each possessed the ability, through unknown means, of unleashing a beam of pure warp energy that could annihilate anything in its path, including a planet. During Abaddon's previous invasion of Imperial space 1,000 years before in the so-called Gothic War, he had managed to capture 2 of the fortresses. Since that day, the Adeptus Mechanicus had worked furiously to find a way to protect against that planet-killing assault. By combining the technology of the Void Shield with the Geller Field, they had found a way to emit a shield that could dissipate the warp beam. Unfortunately, the fruit of these labors, Cadia's null array projectors, had been damaged during the Chaos Siege. To gain enough time for repairs to be made, Wolf Lord Sven Bloodhowl of the Space Wolves used his battle barge Firemane's Fang to launch a costly boarding assault of the Will of Eternity. The Space Marines hoped to slow its progress towards Cadia long enough for the null array to come back online. As Creed prepared to meet Abaddon's assault, the Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Cawl, a senior tech priest of Mars who specialized in the military arts, had been directed by the Harlequin Salandri Veilwalker to the world of Ariad IV. This world had been assaulted by Abaddon during the Fourth Black Crusade, over 6,000 years before. Despite being attacked by a powerful tribe of orcs who called the planet home, Cawl discovered that Abaddon had come to the world purposefully. It had once been home to massive alien pylons built by the Necrons millions of years before that were intended to push back the power of the warp. Similar pylons were scattered across the surface of Cadia and were responsible for repelling the influence of the Eye of Terror and creating the stable passage out of the warp rift known as the Cadian Gate. Abaddon had come to Ariad to destroy the pylons. Cawl realized that he had to get to Cadia immediately. Abaddon didn't want to conquer the fortress world. He wanted to destroy its pylons and weaken the barrier between real space and the warp. While Cawl's actions had been directed by the Harlequins as part of the final act, another key player, the Necron overlord Trazyn the Infinite, entered the conflict for his own selfish reasons. Trazyn was an obsessive collector of relics tied to important events throughout galactic history. He kept these prized possessions in stasis vaults on his homeworld. But as the 13th Black Crusade began, one of those relics, an Imperial artifact called the Bell of St. Gerstal, began to chime 13 times. Each chime caused widespread destruction to Trazyn's precious vaults. Intrigued by what had caused the bell to ring, Trazyn began to investigate with the aid of a Necron artifact called the Celestial Orrery. The Orrery displayed a real-time, holographic map of the galaxy. He learned that Cadia had come under assault by Chaos, and that Abaddon aimed to destroy Cadia's Necron-built pylons. Unwilling to see Chaos sweep across the galaxy, and perhaps also to collect new artifacts, Trazyn made his way to Cadia. He carried with him a few choice pieces of his collection in case of emergencies. On Cadia, Trazyn secretly repaired the planetary null array, and even tripled its efficiency with the addition of Necron technology. When the Will of Eternity moved into position to fire its warp beam, the null array activated and surrounded the fortress world in a cloak of protective energy. Angered, Abaddon ordered his lieutenant, the Demon Prince of Khorne Urkanthos, to launch a ground assault and destroy the shield generator. For 8 days, Urkanthos' troops battered Khazar Kraf with Chaos Space Marines and the horrors of the warp. Inch by inch, the Demon Prince gained ground, until he swept at last into the Imperium's final stronghold on Cadia. He immediately headed for the command bastion, where the shield generator was located. Only a final obstacle lay in his way: the Sisters of Battle, Genevieve and Eleanor, of the Order of Our Martyred Lady. Despite their heroic resistance, the Demon Prince killed both, and prepared to destroy the array, dooming Cadia. But in that moment, a miracle occurred. The living Saint Celestine, a Sister of Battle whose faith in the God Emperor was so pure that after her death she was resurrected into an immortal being of the warp, appeared above Khazar Kraf, held aloft on angelic wings. She led 5 companies of the Martyred Lady that had been thought lost for 1400 years in the Immaterium. Urkanthos boasted that even Celestine could not defeat him alone. She smiled at his arrogance and promised, "I am not alone, and your hour is done." With a wave of her hand, the battle sisters Genevieve and Eleanor sprang to life to fight at her side once more. Together, they slew the servant of the blood god. His lifeless corpse was thrown from the Khazar's walls, and for a time, the forces of chaos retreated in fear. It was then that Ursarkar Creed's unlikely call for help was finally answered. The Imperial Fist Chapter's mobile fortress monastery and protector of Terra, the Star Fortress Phalanx, emerged from the warp above Cadia. It brushed aside the leading edge of the Black Fleet and closed on its primary target, the Will of Eternity. Within the Blackstone Fortress, Sven Bloodhowl's Space Wolves were still alive, progressing ever deeper into the construct's heart. Like a living thing, the fortress actually aided their advance, unsealing bulkheads and disengaging automated defenses almost as if it wanted to aid in its own destruction. When the Space Wolves saw Phalanx arrive, they knew there was a chance to end the fortress's existence. When the Phalanx crew noticed that the Blackstone Fortress was already damaged by Bloodhowl's Space Wolves, they unleashed the full fury of its main batteries. The Will of Eternity's weakened armor cracked like an eggshell, bleeding brilliant purple light into the void. But the fortress was not entirely destroyed, and its cracked husk broke into 3 fragments that remained in orbit of Cadia like a broken moon. On the surface, in the battered fortress of Khazar-Kraf, Ursarkar E took little comfort in the destruction of the fortress. This was no victory. It was only survival for a few more hours. On the Vengeful Spirit, Abaddon's flagship, the War Master of Chaos had an excellent view of his servant's failure. The Despoiler would have to conclude the war on Cadia himself, and he prepared to lead the next ground assault personally. Before that attack could begin, Imperial reinforcements from orbit slipped past the Chaos fleet. These included Imperial Fist Space Marines from the Phalanx, but also an Adeptus Mechanicus fleet inbound from the world of Ariad IV. Belisarius Cawl himself soon made clear to the surprised defenders of Khazar-Kraf that he was eager to get to work and save Cadia from falling to the Despoiler. Cawl knew that Cadia must withstand Abaddon's forces, or Terra itself would soon be at risk.